Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. While everyone is joining, we're just going to have in the background playing a WSIS video just while people are entering the webinar, and then we'll get underway in this session on Indigenous peoples and connectivity, bridging the digital divide.
A multi-stakeholder United Nations Summit, the World Summit on the Information Society Forum 2021 was initiated in January and will culminate in the final week held from the 17th to the 21st of May. Representing the largest gathering of the ICT for Development community globally, WSIS provides a platform for those using information and communication technologies to promote sustainable development, highlighting the role of the WSIS action lines to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So far, over 10,000 participants have joined in over the 120 virtual workshops featured, directly through Zoom, through Facebook Live, or other applications. Shaped through more than 500 inputs and suggestions received from our stakeholders during the open consultation process, the agenda of the WSIS Forum features a weekly program with exciting workshops and sessions based on thematic areas deemed as important by our stakeholders. We're delighted to see well-balanced contribution in terms of geographical location, gender balance, and stakeholder type, which has shown the positive commitment towards the WSIS process and the strengthening of the WSIS implementation of activities to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The agenda and program of the WSIS Forum cover all the action lines and are aligned with the SDGs. Some of the thematic areas addressed, known as special tracks, include ICTs and gender mainstreaming, ICTs and older persons, ICTs and accessibility for persons with disabilities and specific needs, cybersecurity, and many more, all of which are available on the 2021 WSIS Forum website. The WSIS Forum 2021 also features a high-level track, which gathers high-level representatives from various sectors with ministers, deputies, ambassadors, heads of regulatory bodies, private sector, civil society, academia, and the technical community to discuss the role of ICTs as a means of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and targets. The 2021 WSIS Chairman, His Excellency Mr. Maxime Parshin, and the high-level track facilitators will provide an executive summary of the high-level track outcomes during the final week of the forum, sharing the emerging trends, challenges, and opportunities noted by the diverse group of high-level track facilitators through the course of the high-level policy sessions. The sectoral, regional, and gender diversity of our stakeholders is also displayed in our virtual exhibition space that was inaugurated on March 15th, as well as our various social media platforms. We invite you to follow the WSIS process on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for regular updates and exciting news about the forum, such as the fact that we received a record number of submissions for the WSIS prizes this year, with over 1,270 projects submitted and 1.3 million votes that were cast for the 360 nominated projects. Visit the WSIS Prize website to learn more, with the 18 winners being announced during the 18th of May during the special ceremony.
Take the dog.
Announced that the WSIS Forum special track on ICTs and older persons will be initiating a special prize this year entitled the WSIS Healthy Aging Innovation Prize. Additionally, in collaboration with the Global Coalition on Aging, WSIS is co-organizing a virtual hackathon. With more than 1,000 registered participants, the hack will continue until April. Hackers had the opportunity to meet with experts in the field of ICTs and aging during the 3 mentorship sessions featured. Stay tuned for the announcements of the 4 winners, decided by a distinct panel of judges and announced on May 17th during the final week of the 2021 WSIS Forum. We look forward to your participation and thank stakeholders for their contribution in shaping this year's WSIS Forum with ongoing commitment and support. We would also like to extend a warm thank you to our partners, without whom this forum would not be possible. Thank you, and we look forward to a successful WSIS Forum 2021.
Thank you so much. And that was a brief video while we were just having everybody join. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to this side event for the 2021 UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues on Indigenous Peoples and Connectivity, Bridging the Digital Divide. A special welcome to those of you who are joining us very late at night or very early in the morning. We are very delighted to have you with us. We really appreciate it. My name is Ursula Weinhoeven, IT representative to the UN for the ITU here in New York. The ITU is the specialized agency for ICTs, and it's a real honor to co-host this session today with the Permanent Mission of Australia to the UN, DESA, and the WSIS Forum. And we do thank the WSIS for giving us their platform this morning. And I'm going to be moderating this session. ITU is committed to connecting the world wherever people live and whatever their means. And this includes digital inclusion for Indigenous communities, which we're going to talk about today. Just very briefly, a few words of introduction. The COVID-19 pandemic has really underscored the urgency of accelerating progress towards digital inclusion for all. That's something that's become so clear to us all. And it highlighted the importance of information and communication technologies, ICTs, for continued functioning of societies, but has also brought to the fore the startling digital inequalities between and within countries, especially for Indigenous communities. More than ever before, people the world over have needed to rely on ICTs, including for information, work, to conduct their business, access for information, for health and for other services, as well as to connect with each other safely. And yet Indigenous communities remain underserved, among those least likely to be connected to the internet, and often lack equal opportunities to acquire digital skills needed to make the most of ICTs. This side event will look at the challenges and solutions and highlight some examples of existing initiatives enhancing digital inclusion of Indigenous peoples. It will also highlight lessons learned for replicating such initiatives by and within other Indigenous communities with a view to accelerating closing the digital divide. Our full speaker bios are on the WSIS website where you registered for this event, and I'll introduce our terrific speakers as we go along. We are recording this session, and you will be able to access the recording on the WSIS 2021 website afterwards. You can ask questions in the Q&A function on your screen, and we invite the speakers to have an eye on the Q&A area and feel free to answer those questions before and after you're speaking by typing your answer. And if time permits, we'll also ask the speakers some of the questions live. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite His Excellency Ambassador, Mr. Mitch Fifield, Permanent Representative of Australia to the United Nations, for his opening remarks. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Ursula, and terrific to see you, and also wonderful to see Michaela Jade, who is such a great digital innovator and cultural champion. I know Michaela from my past life as Australia's Minister for Communications and the Arts, so wonderful to see you. But before I begin, colleagues, I'd very much like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Manhattan area from where I'm joining this call, and I speak of the Lenape people, so I do acknowledge them. I'd also like to acknowledge all Indigenous people here with us today. I pay my respects to you, your cultures, and to elders past, present, and those that are still to come. Friends, this is a wonderful and important forum that we're gathered in today. And it's just so important that in this week we spend some time to talk about Indigenous peoples and connectivity. And thank you so much to the ITU for the invitation today. As I mentioned before, in a previous life, I was the Communications and Arts Minister in Australia. So this is a topic that I do feel particularly passionate about. All of us know that digital technologies are absolutely changing the way that we live, the way that we work, the way that we do business. COVID has accelerated the trends that were already there. Access to digital technologies is even more critical than ever before in the wake of COVID in terms of how people fully participate in social and economic life. If you can't connect, you can't participate. It's really that simple. For Indigenous people, digital technologies have the potential to be even more positive than they have been so far. The opportunity to open new universes of action, opportunities for people to tell their own stories further afield than they have before and faster than they have before, and also to record and to preserve those stories, both new stories and ancient stories. And I just want to give a few examples from Australia. Since 1994, the Ara Uritija project has enabled Aboriginal people in the remote AYP lands in South Australia to compile a rich digital archive of historical and cultural artefacts. There's also the award-winning Living First Languages program developed by the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation. And this supports communities to document sounds and songs and stories within their languages. And community-led media organisations, which have traditionally used the older platforms or platforms of long standing, such as radio and television, are increasingly developing culturally appropriate content for delivery via digital platforms. So the potential economic, social and cultural benefits of digital technology for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are clear, but we don't want them to be just potential opportunities. We want them to be realised. But it has to be acknowledged that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do face more obstacles than other Australians when it comes to accessing digital technologies. And just a snapshot, in 2020, a national survey on digital inclusion indicated a gap of almost 8 index points in digital inclusion for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And COVID, as I said before, has made it even clearer than before that we do need to bridge this digital divide. With so many people being at home, working from home, trying to work from home, trying to study from home, we need to bridge the gap. And on behalf of the Australian government, can I say that we are committed to bridging the gap in digital inclusion between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other Australians. That's why Indigenous digital inclusion is part of our overarching national agreement on closing the gap, which has been developed in partnership, I should say, between Australian governments, state and federal, and the coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations. The agreement does include a target for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have equal levels of digital inclusion by 2026. And together with Indigenous Australian stakeholders, we're developing an Indigenous digital inclusion plan to help achieve this. Limited access to telecommunications infrastructure also continues to be a barrier to digital inclusion for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live in remote Australia, and that is a significant number of people. Our expansive landmass, our low population density does, and I know this from personal experience, make it challenging to deliver information and communications technologies quickly and cost effectively, particularly in remote Australia. But having said that, that is absolutely no excuse not to do it, not to make it happen. And that's something that we're looking to address through some substantial investment. Just a few quick examples on that front. Our national broadband network carrier, NBN Co, has created a $300 million regional co-investment fund that will help deliver access to higher speed wholesale broadband services to regional households and businesses. And we're also committing around $4 million per year to maintain and monitor over 500 community payphones and satellite Wi-Fi telephones, generally located in small, very remote communities with less than 50 permanent residents. So this is a relatively low-cost solution which enables people to live on their traditional country. And we've also committed an investment of more than $460 million to improve access to telecommunications services in regional and remote Australia through a combination of satellite and terrestrial technologies. Alongside investment in infrastructure, there is a need for targeted, culturally appropriate digital literacy training to ensure that Indigenous people are supported in their learning and their use of digital technologies. It's not just a case of build it and they will come. People need to have the skills to take up these opportunities. Back home, we introduced the Your Online Journey app in 2019 to help address the digital literacy and safety needs of remote Indigenous communities, just as one instance. And the Australian Government's e-Safety Commissioner, again, I had the carriage of that in my previous existence. Our e-Safety Commissioner has been undertaking a number of projects to address technology-facilitated abuse towards Aboriginal women and to improve the digital literacy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders. It's important to acknowledge that technology does open up vast opportunities, but sadly, regrettably, it also opens up opportunities for people who want to do wrong and who want to do harm. And so we have to make sure that we have protections for people, which we do through the e-Safety Commissioner, but also that people have the knowledge on the ways that they can protect themselves. So friends, that's a brief summary of activities in Australia, but of course, this is a challenge which can only be addressed when we listen to the voices of Indigenous people and share our experiences with each other. So thank you again for the opportunity to share some of the things that we're doing. This is a hugely important area. It's also hugely exciting because it really can make a big difference to the quality of people's lives. And that's why we do what we do in the UN, at the ITU. It really ultimately only has meaning to the extent that it can help improve and support the quality of life of people. So I'm very much looking forward to learning from others here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Fifield. They were great framing remarks, and it was really helpful to kick us off with your wonderful description of a number of the actions that Australia is taking on this front. Now I'm going to turn to my partner in crime, Amin Lambarat from DESA, who's going to share with us the opening remarks from Daniela Buss, Director, Division for Inclusive Social Development at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Amin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ursula. Before I play the video message of my director, Ms. Daniela Buss, I just would like again to thank our partners, ITU, Permanent Mission of Australia to the UN, the WSIS Forum, our excellent speakers, and the audience who are joining us today. So the digital world must be inclusive, as we said, to everyone, everywhere. Thank you. I will play now the video of my director, Ms. Daniela Buss. Just 1 second.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be here at this very important event on Indigenous peoples and connectivity, bridging the digital divide. And I thank you very much, ITU and all our partners. We know that there are 370 million Indigenous peoples in the world, and they are very much discriminated and excluded. And there are so many barriers that prevent their enjoyment of fundamental rights, including cultural rights. And Indigenous peoples today are among those most disadvantaged and left behind in the world. The division I lead, the Division for Inclusive Social Development in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, serves as a secretariat at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And this year we are focusing on the Sustainable Development Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. And the primary UN framework for securing the culture and traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that guarantees the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, including manifestations of their science, technologies, and cultures. And look at the Articles 11 and 31. And now when it comes to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it highlights the need for access to information and communication technologies. And this is related to the SDG 9 that calls all member states to build resilient infrastructures, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and fostering innovation. Because, you know, leaving no one behind means leaving no one offline. 3.7 billion people do not use internet, either because they don't have the connectivity or because they do not have the skills to use digital technologies. So it's very important to close the digital divide. Digital technologies are empowering billions of individuals around the world and bringing numerous opportunities for the advancement of social progress. And it's so important, therefore, that digital technologies offer the potential to support the creation of new culturally appropriate learning resources and environments for Indigenous peoples. And these technologies can support reinforcement and revitalization of Indigenous languages and improve their access to education and health services. So there is such a huge potential where we have to work together in partnerships between Indigenous peoples, the state, civil society, and of course the private sector. And we also know effective participation of Indigenous peoples in the orientation and implementation of any policy, be that it is public or so, it's a prerequisite. We have to ensure equitable access to the global information society, and Indigenous peoples have to adapt it to their own patterns and protocols of communication. Indigenous peoples themselves are taking initiatives and steps to keep their traditions in this modern world. And I'll give you an example, you know, the use of Facebook and social media to sustain and cultivate their traditions. We also know that in 2019, it was the International Year of Languages and Indigenous languages, which then brought to the adoption of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And there are something like 3,000 out of the world's 6,000 to 7,000 languages estimated that are in serious danger. So if we use the digital technologies, of course, they cannot replace indigenous traditional ways of knowing, but they can help to preserve and transmit ways of life, which include also ways of knowing, and to transfer the knowledge of languages to younger generations. So, ladies and gentlemen, indeed, there is lots that we still need to do, but with concerted efforts, we can promote connectivity as a strategy that includes also partnering with Indigenous communities. There is much to do. We have to continue promoting access to digital technologies and the necessary skills to use it also for and with Indigenous communities. We needed to address key issues of importance for Indigenous peoples, including building back better because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we need to highlight discrimination, issues of land rights, and the increasing number of related conflicts and reprisal against Indigenous peoples. Let's support with, by, for Indigenous peoples their participation in decision-making processes, and recognize that Indigenous peoples are indispensable partners to contribute to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We in DESA stand ready to support all initiatives, and I thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you so much, Daniela and Amin. It is now my pleasure to turn to our first panelist, Ms. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues member and SDG advocate of the UN Secretary General. Ms. Umaru Ibrahim, why is bridging the digital divide for Indigenous peoples so important? And what messages on this theme of meaningful connectivity for Indigenous peoples would you like to see the Permanent Forum and governments take up? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ursula, and hi everyone. It's really a great pleasure actually to use a digital divide to meet with you, because normally the Permanent Forum is supposed to be in person in New York, and we're supposed to meet with all of you and discuss all those issues, maybe personally or over coffee or whatever. And this is also one of the how we are using the digital divided and how we turn all our work. So it is so important now than ever. And we all saw that since last year. Ambassador, you say it, and I mean, and all of you say it's so important because it's not only our work that turn it into digital, but our life turn it into digital, from the socials, economy, and environment, everything changing and moving very fast. I'm going to give you the quick 3 perspectives. Firstly, participation, second into economy, and thirdly in environment. So participations for Indigenous peoples since the COVID started, it has been so difficult, even for developing countries as member states, to participate in a decision making. And for Indigenous peoples, it's completely an exclusion from participating in the decision making. And we can say the easier one, communication. Ambassador, you also say, when the COVID arrived, everyone communicated through radio, televisions, and more in social media. Because I can give you the example of my country, Chad. Each ministry, from the presidency, from the health ministries, from the market ministry, everyone coming with a decisions. And at the end of the day, it is very easy to take those decisions through the social media and distribute them. And they are in Arabic or in French. And most of the Indigenous communities do not speak those languages firstly, and they do not read and write. And they do not have even access to the electricity and getting access to the internet and getting these information. So the discrimination was so clear for all the Indigenous communities and for most of the peoples who do not get access to those luxury at the end of the day. And that create a divisions on the health issue system. But so far, Indigenous communities, through our own way of communication, we changed the way. So the positive response to this communication was we created some WhatsApp groups. And we was throwing the information in the oral messages in our mother tongues to explain to the communities what is happening. And they just like have to turn off the button. If one person got access to the WhatsApp, he can listen the message and make the rest of the people listening, even there is no access to the television or radios. So we have the gap and we create the solutions as Indigenous peoples. And in these participations to the international meetings, I can assure you in this permanent forum happening since last week. So we got the registered peoples to get the floor to speak. From Indigenous peoples, we have around 135. Ask me how many from African Indigenous peoples. Less than 6 peoples got to register. Why? Because it was so difficult to understand the different platforms to go in and then to connect and register and say, I wanted to take the floor on this agenda item or that agenda item. So the complexity of all this digital divide are not permitted to the Indigenous peoples to get access to the right to participate. And in the other hand, when we have other negotiations, I attended to the climate change. Most of the time, we are 1 or 2 people from Africa attending, and maybe 1 or 2 from Pacific and other places. So there is 2 things, the time differences and the language who are not adopted to translate. Of course, access to the internet is becoming a big issue. So when there is an in-person meeting, it is very easy that all the partners from UN, from other organizations, to pay a ticket, to pay an hotel and per diems for the people who are coming from the villages to participate in the meetings. But now when we turn into the or the virtual world, they say that them offices are not adapted to just send a small packet of the money to buy an internet connectivity or to just make someone travel from the rural areas to the town to access internet. So this is so contradictory, how we can all fix this manner of participation, because we cannot take the decision by leaving a community's entire behind. This is the concept of the SDGs. We need to adapt all our system to the new coming. And this is also the important way of how we can make it work. So training for accessing the different platforms is very important. Turning, adapting all our funding to be flexible, to fund the participation is very important. I was so touched with our regional consultations. Someone used to say, listen, Hindu, we are not asking for the ticket to travel. We are asking only for $100 to buy internet and to attend the consultation during all those hours. Why we cannot get them? I was so shocked. We cannot turn one ticket to make participate more than 20, 30 peoples. It's so shame, so we need to turn this shame in a positive way. Secondly, quickly, digital divide and economy. During the COVID, developed countries turn it all, even shopping for food. You can do that online because you have a restriction to go out. But for indigenous peoples who do not have access to the bank account or credit card, they cannot get access to buy all the things online. And for the indigenous peoples who are in the developing countries, so it's completely depending of the daily market. So we cannot buy things in the internet or whatever. So how we can also create access to the market on need. So we have also good examples through the mobile funding. So the mobile transfer funding, it's so easy to give it to all the communities who are in the remote areas. But we need to develop access to the market through the divided, and then peoples can also, in the indigenous communities, can buy. Quickly, the last point is in environment. This is the positive one. We are all using the digital divided. We are using the ICT to map our land, to map our natural resources and to protect it. And my best example I'm giving always, the 3D participatory mapping, but this year I'm going to do a 2D participatory mapping. And when we do the map, we will digitalize it in order to keep it and share it with everyone who can access the internet, who can access just the computers to have the map, and that can help us to better manage our natural resources. So my conclusions is, it is so important. Our world is turning very fast, but we need to adapt and give also the chance to indigenous peoples to turn. When the developed countries are dreaming about the flying cars, we still in the tech industrialized revolutions. So this inequality, we need to feed this gap. And we got the time now, and we got the technology now. So let us make the equity and justice to indigenous peoples to get access to this new world. Thank you so much, Ursha, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Hindu, for the really powerful comments and call to action, and also just really for emphasizing how critical participation and ability to participate online is also to participate offline, and that strong interconnection. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask our wonderful colleague Anastasia from ITU Geneva if she could please keep an eye on the chat and clean it up. And I just do ask people to please be respectful of our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to Mr. Roberto Macara Barrero, Guanania Taino Tribe President, United Confederation of Taino People. Roberto, I'm going to ask you the same questions that I asked Hindu. Why is bridging the digital divide for Indigenous peoples so important? What messages on this theme of meaningful connectivity for Indigenous peoples would you like to see the Permanent Forum and governments take up? Thank you so much, Roberto.
Taigwe, Ditu, Hahom, and greetings all. I just wanted to say Taigwe itunokna datia ono diri mukaro agwebana oriken taino daka. Just to quickly introduce myself in my indigenous language. And I think it's important as we talk about ICTs and bridging the digital divide that we remember, as my sister Hindu stated, that our peoples have our own languages, and that needs to be taken into consideration when we talk about rollout, when we talk about programs, etc. You know, I participated in both of the World Summit on the Information Society events, originally the 2 phases, and heard the voices, participated in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. And what's interesting to me is that, at that time, 2003, 2005, when we issued many of these declarations and recommendations to the world community, here we are in 2021, and we're still talking about the same issues. And while there has been some progress, that progress has been slow. And as you've mentioned, and as our previous speakers have mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted that gap between those who are information rich and those who are information impoverished. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the, the overarching concepts that I think that perhaps maybe we still need to look at as we're hoping to connect the the information society to the sustainable development goals, which was called for back during that WSIS process as well. And it would be interesting for me to see how the forum could perhaps take stock in what was called for during the WSIS process, follow up, for example, to the C8 action line, and see where it intersects with the sustainable development goals, and maybe see where the gaps are, and really put that out there as a possible focus. But just to get back to the overall concepts, I think that you know we talk about the digital revolution. I mean, we know that ICTs and the information society, it's here. That train is already out of the station, and we either have to get on or let it pass us by as indigenous peoples. But there's a lot of factors, as previously mentioned, that present the challenge to getting on that train. So, when we talk about the digital divide, we're really talking about disparities and exclusion. I think our previous speakers have really pointed that out. And indigenous peoples, of course, around the world are increasingly aware, especially during this time period that we find ourselves in, how socially, economically, and digitally disadvantaged we are. So, as a result of our impoverished socio-economic positions, we know that many indigenous peoples around the world are distinctly disadvantaged with regard to digital information, access, and distribution. And this is whether they're residing in developed or developing countries. As previously mentioned, there's also a disadvantage in terms of literacy and skills-based capacities required for the effective use of ICTs, and that we can really see that these disparities, they're really linked to social, economic, and political opportunity, right? And again, that highlights the existing inequalities that constrain the access. And these times we see this perpetuated and exacerbated by digital disadvantage. So let me just move on and just say that indigenous peoples, many that I've talked to over the years, and I think that some of these points, I did do a report for UNESCO on behalf of UNESCO that was presented to the world community. That report was called Indigenous Peoples and the Information Society, Emerging Uses of ITCs. That was put out in 2016. And there was a real highlight in that report that I think probably, again, still many of these issues are so pertinent and relevant even today, even the recommendations that came out in that report. So I would urge, if you can, check that out, and you can get into some of these ideas a little more. But I think that it's important to highlight here that there's a real understanding, at least amongst the indigenous peoples who participate in the WSIS process. And they reaffirm this position time and time again, that the dignity and human rights of indigenous peoples, nations, and tribes need to be respected if the economic, information, and digital divide, which separates technology-rich nations and the private sector from most marginalized peoples of society, including indigenous peoples, nations, and tribes, is to be bridged. So, from that perspective, bridging the economic, information, and digital divides can be really linked to the core rights, such as freedom of expression and the right to receive information. So this also places the media within this frameworks of the human rights regime. That's important to note, as our first speaker, the distinguished ambassador, had pointed out. So within this context, I think media and rights should not be understood as merely the ability to view indigenous program or listen to indigenous news, but there's also with a highlight of language, there's a clear linguistic and cultural rights implications that need to be underscored as we look for solutions to solve these problems. So I want to also just talk about a little bit about how we engage indigenous peoples in these discussions. For us as indigenous peoples, engagement with United Nations or with governments, we've seen engagement in the past in what I'd like to highlight as three categories. So there's a pro-indigenous engagement, which really means that people are doing something for indigenous peoples. Like, we'll set up this program to help indigenous peoples, right? But there's really no connection with. So then there's also para indigenous, meaning working with, that there's some collaboration with indigenous peoples. But then finally, I think that we're moving towards this, but we really need to scale this up, is the per indigenous, meaning initiatives that are led or undertaken by indigenous peoples themselves, who really know what they want. So that I think that's understanding those three engagement frameworks, and moving more towards the final one, letting indigenous people lead, providing opportunities to build those skills, are really important. And finally, again, I would urge folks to, if they have an opportunity, to really look at that report that I mentioned, but really for some final recommendations. One would be foster policies and projects that enable approaches to ICTs that are developed with or by indigenous peoples. That's that para and pro. There's foster policies and programs that promote media pluralism and inclusive indigenous media, getting involved there. And as mentioned by one of our previous speakers, really increase access, right? That focus on infrastructure and access. And remember that while we're doing this, there's also attitudes, right, of indigenous peoples. Many indigenous peoples are embracing ICTs, but because of the history of colonialism, obviously there's some suspicion. We've also had some recent, at least in the United States, there's recent examples of data sovereignty breaches. So these issues cause indigenous peoples to become more wary, and I'm sure some of our next speakers will be talking a little bit more about this. But also, when you're talking about development and engaging with indigenous peoples, we're thinking about long-term goals here, but oftentimes projects and initiatives are short-term, right? So we really need to move to longer-term support. And I think that I'll end here, and I look forward to engaging in the rest of the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberto. And we pasted a link to your really important paper in the chat so people can have access to that. And thanks in particular as well for your really important engagement framework, which is, I think, incredibly helpful for everybody to be aware of and to put into action. Now let us turn to Michaela Jade. She's a Cabrogal woman of the Darug-speaking nation, as well as CEO and founder of Indigital. Michaela, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated reliance on the internet across almost every area of life, including in education, making it more important than ever to urgently close the digital divide, as we've just been talking about for First Nations students as well as others. How can we bring educators and leaders together on the journey of reimagining our education systems so that they're more inclusive of First Nations people, knowledge and perspectives, and give equal opportunity to a digital future? And the second question, if you could also address, is that I believe you're also going to speak with us about disruptive experiences that open real potential for positive transformation. But how can we build coalitions and leverage our networks and industries to promote digital inclusion and access for First Nation peoples and what are some examples? Thank you so much, Michaela. Over to you.
Thank you, Ursula. Big questions. Warami Yanama Bujuri Gumada. I want to acknowledge also my brothers and sisters, who some of which I've had the opportunity to work with for a number of years, and thank you for your opening remarks to Ambassador. As we've discussed, there's 400 million people who don't view the world through the Western lens on which ICT systems are built. And that means acknowledging that our peoples have the right to learn ICT systems through our own cultural lenses and languages. And some of the ways that we've been doing that in Australia, and particularly through the work at Indigital, is creating our own learning resources that are co-designed by our elders and knowledge holders and language speakers in our communities. So we bring our old people, our young people, and our middle people, which I'm part of, together on a journey. I think it's really important to make sure that we're not prioritizing in the education system just young people, because our elders have an incredible amount of knowledge and experience and wisdom to bring to the education side of things when it comes to ICT and learning computing skills. The reason that it's important that we can see ourselves in these technologies is so we're not just consumers of the technologies that already exist, but we have the opportunity to participate in designing new ICT systems, including fourth industrial revolution technologies and things like the spatial web. So we're working in mixed and augmented realities in Australia through cultural knowledge, language and law. And we're saying we want to be part of these new future technologies, including the space industry, and looking at the world through not just a Western context, but also our Indigenous lenses as well. And could you imagine, we have satellite arrays above us right now that are helping us broadcast some of this content, and all of those systems have been designed with massive cultural biases. So imagine if our people were able to contribute to building new technologies that looked at the land through an Indigenous lens, how much richer the information that we're gleaning from these technologies would be. It's important to do that and to have participation in designing our futures, because we need to eliminate the biases, of course, but we also need the opportunities to create new economies. And I want to shout out to the nation of Hawaii and Brandon Makawawa, who have created their own cryptocurrency for their people so they can trade in the ways that they want to in these digital environments. Also working with communities to host our augmented and mixed reality content on NFTs. So they have an opportunity to earn income from where they are with what they have, with their own language and knowledge embedded in cultural expressions that are holographic, for example. The reason that I think that's important is that we need to know that our people are positioned to know our worth in digital economies, and that we're not co-opted into modern slavery through cultural biases and cultural capability biases that see us as being kind of the bottom dwellers of the digital food chains and just subsets of people that can only be trained in the most basic of ICT infrastructure. I don't want that future for my people, and I certainly don't want my daughters participating in that future. So I think we need to lift our sights into these fourth industrial revolution technologies, bring our people into the fold so we can help design these, because designing the current ICT systems without an Indigenous lens hasn't been incredibly successful, and we've created this massive gap. So what can we do in the next iteration of the fourth industrial revolution technologies to make sure that our peoples are not just consuming this, or not just being plugged in as part of a modern slavery system, but we're actually designing it for the benefit of all people and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michaela. Absolutely fantastic. And I really always appreciate how you talk about the important role of emerging technologies as well, and the power and the potential for empowerment as well. As folks can probably tell, we are running behind time, but I'm also really appreciating in the chat how all our audience is just loving all of our participants, all of our speakers. So I definitely don't want to cut anyone short, and WSIS will actually allow us to have more time. So before I turn to Dara, And I see Dara and Eric say that they can stay longer. I don't want to cut anyone short. So everyone's been given 7 minutes. So we will extend longer, and we will hope that our audience can stay with us and hear fully from our fantastic speakers. So with that, I'm now going to turn to Dara Blackwater from the Navajo Nation and University of Arizona. Dara, what is the status of connectivity in Indigenous communities today here in the US, and what are some of the challenges that create the digital divide? And connectedly, what solutions do you see for closing the digital divide in Indigenous communities, and how does the sovereign power of Native nations fit into those solutions? So Dara, over to you.
Those are such big questions, and I'm excited to answer them. So I'll introduce myself first. Dara Blackwater Yinashia, Besh Bachain Nishle dot Sena Jenny Bashish Chin, Ado Besh Bachai Dashiche, Ado Touch Ini Dashanale. So my name is Dara Blackwater. I am Dene. I'm of the Navajo Nation here in present day America. And I am a recent graduate of the University of Arizona, and I am doing a policy fellowship there now, working on these issues. And I just want to say that I feel so lucky to follow Michaela as well as all of our speakers today, just because there have been so many great ideas that I now get to build off of, which makes my job easier. So thank you so much. As far as the current status of Indigenous communities today or the connectivity in Indigenous communities in America, it is so widespread. So there are 574 federally recognized Indigenous tribes in America. And there are even more who are state recognized or seeking recognition or not seeking recognition and just existing like they have been for thousands of years. And so that means that as far as policy and the journey to connecting their citizens goes, each Native nation has its own journey, and they're all on their own, in a different space on that journey. And so that means that some are just starting out, perhaps. Some are just getting feasibility studies, figuring out what is it going to take, both financially and as far as infrastructure and hardware and digital literacy training, what is it going to take to really connect their citizens? And these are the questions that they're starting to ask themselves and figure out what are their real priorities. For some Native nations, their priorities might be connecting their tribal headquarters. The chief of Pamunkey was just saying on a call the other day that their tribal headquarters doesn't even have connection. For others, it might be starting with their schools. There's a tribe up in present-day Washington called Makah, where they were going to have to bus all of their students in their whole school system 40 minutes away on a dangerous road just to take standardized testing. And so, and yet others maybe are focusing on economic development, if they have casinos that need to be online, or if they're putting in data centers where they really want to house that data on their own lands and have it be sovereign and just theirs. So everyone is really digesting all of the possibilities of how to connect their citizens and their nations right now. And that looks different for every individual nation. But I'll throw a few stats at you. Right now, we're looking at 7 out of 10 homes in rural tribal areas that are not connected in Indigenous communities. And while 92% of housing units on urban tribal lands are covered, even the statistics are problematic in that a lot of times the internet service providers are the ones reporting the statistics of who is covered by internet and who is not covered by internet to the FCC, which is our governing body over all of this. And if those statistics are not accurate and not an accurate depiction of who is connected and who's not, or perhaps they have the possibility to be connected, but it doesn't support streaming, the connection is not strong enough to do what we're doing right now, or it's so expensive that nobody can afford it. And so there is a service there, but if it's too expensive, nobody's actually going to be connected, especially in impoverished communities. So these are some of the challenges that we're seeing. But we're also seeing so many Native nations who are really feeling empowered and taking the initiative. Normal people, not people who graduated necessarily from Stanford in a tech field, people who are people who care about their communities, who care about their children, and who really want to see their people and their nations move forward. These are the people who are connecting Native nations in America. And they are doing such an incredible job of it, especially as they become more empowered in what they're doing. And so really, what that looks like now is just making sure that they have the resources and that we're not tripping them up at every step in order to allow them to connect their citizens and their nations. And one of the things that I've really focused on in my scholarship and my work is spectrum sovereignty. And so this is an idea that the radio waves, what we need, the natural resource that we utilize in order to facilitate a wireless connection, that spectrum is a natural resource. It's been on the land since time immemorial. And that actually belongs to the Native nations whose land it's on. And so what this means right now is that the FCC, the federal government, is taking that spectrum on tribal lands, selling it to third parties and keeping the money. And so it's really disenfranchising Native nations twice. One, because they don't have the resource, the spectrum they need to create wireless communications on their land. And two, they're being deprived of the economic benefit of spectrum. Since they started doing the auctions, the United States has made $40 billion and now probably more on these spectrum auctions, where they're taking the spectrum license, they're auctioning it off and keeping the money. And they're making billions and billions of dollars. The estimate of what it would take to connect all Indigenous communities in America by experts right now is $7 billion. And there's 56.2 million acres of tribal lands in America recognized right now. And so you take all of that spectrum over tribal lands and you think about how much money the US has made by selling that tribal spectrum. And you can fund broadband projects, you can fund infrastructure, you can fund fiber in Indigenous communities. And that is the resource, that's really the next fight that I see of, really taking back the resources that we need in order to connect our communities. And we're seeing people do it in such beautiful ways. We are seeing empowered people step up and really do this work. And it just brings me so much joy.
Thank you so much, Dara, not only for sharing the perspective in the United States, but also the important work that you're doing and this very, very important perspective and ideas to take up. So now we're going to turn to our last speaker, and I do want to thank everyone again so much for bearing with us. I'm sure you agree that we're hearing such important perspectives that it's really worthwhile letting everybody have their full time. So with that, we're now going to turn to Eric Huerta Velazquez, who's the Coordinator General Adjunto from the Redes por la Diversidad, Equidad y Sustentabilidad. Eric, when we talk about connectivity programs for Indigenous peoples, is it just about connectivity, or are we also talking about something else? And could you share with us some examples of the work that you've been involved in or otherwise seen, and lessons learned that you could draw from it about what works to close the digital divide for Indigenous peoples? Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for having me in this splendid panel. I'm really excited of sharing with you, and I've been very attentive to what you have said. And I think that once we have heard from Roberto, Michaela, Dara, Hindu, we can understand that it's not just about connectivity, that we cannot separate the connectivity issue from the long fight of Indigenous peoples for autonomy and self-determination. And that's why when we are dealing with projects for Indigenous peoples, you have to take in consideration this. And I think that Article 16 of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People said it clearly, as it says, it's the governments have to build the conditions so that Indigenous peoples can have and run and operate their own networks. Then also, I'd like to share with you some of the things that ITU has been doing, and we have been doing with the ITU to reach this goal. And I just want to, I will focus a bit on capacity building, and I would like to share if Anastasia can help me to play just 1 minute, 1:40 for this video that we, on an event we just have at the beginning of the last year.
Yinchi cometonal huancastolomome itechnehin metz de febrero, itechin ometaxo huansempual xiuit, timonechikohke tatamantimasewalme, teinixpowi ne analpataltikpak. Campatimomachtihke, tataman escayot, tenki hualpia, itechnehin teposme huan teposhuehcatanohnontzaloni.
Estamos, qué hacemos, hacia dónde queremos ir. Hablamos sobre qué es la tecnología, hablamos sobre los contenidos, hablamos sobre la sostenibilidad, hablamos también para qué nos serviría aquí la intranet. Y pues la asamblea dijo, tenemos que hacer este proyecto juntas y juntos.
Lo que estamos aquí es algo comunitario, algo pues cooperativo.
La comunicación es un derecho básico, fundamental. Es un derecho humano, es un derecho de las comunidades. También porque el espectro o el uso, ¿no?, de ese espacio donde se transmiten las cosas, las ondas, ¿no? Pues es también parte del territorio que las comunidades habitan.
Después de 6 meses de capacitación, pues, y de concluir ese diplomado, se nos dio la oportunidad de venir a este campamento.
El campamento tiene una construcción especial. Tenemos también la visión desde el diseño.
Well, thanks. I don't know if it was able to see the translation in English of that, but some of the people there talk about that the spectrum is part of the land, its sovereignty, but what I wanted to show, and I choose this from the many programs that ITU has for Indigenous people, is that, as Roberto said, this was done together with Indigenous people and supporting their own initiatives in building capacity. So since this is a program, and a program that came from a previous program run by indigenous communities and indigenous media in Mexico and Latin America that were working in building capacity to have their own technicians and indigenous technicians. And the capacity is built also through their own experience in developing their own media. So that's why it's very important. The program covers many things like community communications, electricity and electronics, free software, Wi-Fi networks, radio broadcasting, mobile, indigenous networks, and regulation and sustainability. The most important thing of this is that it's building a community among these practitioners and these indigenous practitioners of ICTs, and they are helping together to build and run their own networks. How do we got there? ITU, I think since 2002, has a special initiative for indigenous people that right now is in resolution 46 of the WTDC, the World Telecommunications Development Conference. These resolutions talk about many aspects that are necessary to build an enabling environment and policy and regulation for indigenous peoples. And it talks about 3 main topics. One is policy and regulation, access to spectrum, and also capacity building. So in the field of policy and regulation, there has been some sharing of experiences, good practices. Also, in terms of access to spectrum, there is a special recommendation in recommendation 19 that talks about this matter. And in the terms of capacity building, well, we have been doing these programs first in consultation with indigenous people to say, well, we need these such courses. Then there was developed these courses, but in the last years we were able to meet each other, each other experience from the work of ITU and the work for indigenous people that came from the Summit of Indigenous Communication in 2010. So many indigenous communities got together in La Maria Piendamó, indigenous communications, and stay what was important for them regarding ICTs. And related to capacity building, they said that it was important that this was made through their values and cultural heritage. Also, that they have to have their own technicians, they can develop their own technology. And from there, many of the indigenous communities in different countries started to work in programs for building capacity. And one in Mexico was Tequio Comunitario, and this program was run together with indigenous communications, indigenous communities, and was done in the indigenous community. From this, we built a partnership with the ITU, and has been, this is the second diploma course. And I think that just want to share what is behind, what is the principles that building capacity should have according this group of indigenous communities that got together. They said we should build capacity the same way we do that we grow the corn, and it is a system that is called milpa that is shared among America, and it's a combined system of growing corn, but also their vegetables, but also their weeds, and people, they said we have to do it together. We have to do it together, participating as equals, children, old people, everyone. It's also should be practical. You learn it by doing things. It's done in the context of the community, and it incorporates all the traditions as old traditions as well as new techniques. And people at the end share and celebrate this. So I think I'm running out of time, but just to say it at the end, I think that what Roberto mentioned, was important. I think probably it's easier to just start to talk about connectivity, and they should connect indigenous communities. But what we are looking for and what is expected from us from the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People is that these things should be done together and shall be led through their own indigenous peoples communities. Maybe it takes more time, maybe it's a long process, because we have to know each other, we have to trust, we have to build relationships, but it's worth, and it's very enrichful when we do things like this, because we all enrich a lot our knowledge and practice and our own networks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thanks again to our wonderful speakers and audience for being willing to stay with us a bit longer. Ambassador, I just wanted to come back to you. It's been short and sweet, but did you want to make a final remark? And I did want to remind everyone we are recording this, and so we will be making it available. Ambassador?
Thank you, Ursula. I really just want to say thank you to the panelists for enhancing my knowledge. I did work in this area for a time, but it's important for people who work into government to not only see themselves as having carriage of issues, but at the same time, you never stop being a student and learning. So I want to say thank you for that which I've learnt today. And as Michaela mentioned in her presentation, applying a lens, applying the lens of Indigenous people to developing and designing things is just so important. And I think that's a message that has come through each of the presentations, that things can't be done in isolation from communities. Things have got to be done with communities and through their eyes. So thank you so much.
Fantastic, Ambassador. And of course, I think we probably could have talked about this for a lot longer. And I hope there'll be many other opportunities to continue. But in the meantime, there were many fantastic action points identified in areas for future work. And I do hope that the recording will be able to help this reach a much wider audience as well. So with that, I just wanted to say thanks again to our fabulous speakers, to our wonderful co-hosts, Australia, DESA and WSIS, and to our fantastic audience who've shared with us some information through this session. Please, everybody, have a safe and good evening, morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.